this period of British mandatory rule, which infantilized Palestinians and Iraqis and Jordanians and Syrians and Lebanese as not yet ready to stand on their own 2 feet and be independent. This period has usually been talked about as exceptional because the British, the story as it's told is that the British made conflicting promises to 2 sides. Okay? And this is a really problematic way to think about it because it equalizes the colonized and the colonizer. The reason that I believe the British Mandate period, one of the reasons that it's exceptional is because of at this time, the Permanent Mandates Commission, which is the commission that is overseeing the transformation of former colonies of the 3 empires that broke up after World War I. This is the only case in which the Permanent Mandates Commission officially recognizes a settler colony. And so this is a very core to understanding the exceptionalism of this period. So Schechter sort of asked me to begin by saying, why did I start this project? And the reason I started this project is I was living in New York as a graduate student, and I would ride the metro, I would ride the subway, whatever it's called in New York, as everybody calls it something different. And I would be, totally impoverished, living on pizza and coffee and free food whenever there was, somebody giving a talk. And I would see all these images of really beautiful people dressed in such wonderful ways that I was so always taken by, this person that I hoped one day to become, and realizing that I could never ever become that person. And I started really thinking about desire and everydayness and our complicity in capitalism and how it works. And so I began thinking that I would do a project on consumption in Palestine as a way to think about Palestinian consumerism inside Israel, right? So the group of people that are violently, that are given the very violently colonial label of Israeli Arab. I was really thinking about, maybe I can look at their relationship to desire to think about their experience and their relationship to commodities. And then when I started doing this work, I realized if I did that, I would spend the next 10 years of my life studying the Israeli state, and I didn't want that company. And so the kind of idea that I was very interested in, and this is the spinal cord of the book, is how is it that both these Palestinian, what I'm calling men of capital, which is what they call themselves, and the British colonial officials who rule them, are, like many of their contemporaries, very busy with this idea of turning this abstract thing called the economy into something that you can calculate as a measure of progress. So they're calculating it, they're making it visual, they're making it textual, they're making it numerical, and they're all doing it in different ways. And they're thinking about it as a way to manage people. So this is a journal that's interesting, and I actually found our dear friend Munir from Putin found it on the shelves of the Hebrew University library, and I'll be happy to talk a little bit about my archival experiences in this project. This is a journal that begins in 1935 as a bi-monthly and turns into a weekly and continues to be a weekly until 1937. It's a fascinating site where these men of capital, as they call themselves, are thinking about economic thought. So they're working through canonical thinkers like Smith and Marx, but they're also drawing on the philosophy of Lazed and Ibn Khaldun. They're translating from The Economist. They are really trying to understand themselves as vehicles for the translation of economic thought that's happening throughout North Africa, particularly in Egypt, and they're sort of bringing in those translations and those ideas and delivering them. So it's actually they have a regional subscription base. They get as far as Oman. And some of their ideas are very interesting. The guy who runs the journal, who's the main editor, is this funny-looking and cute man who I've spent many days and months and years with, named Fuad Saba, who actually our aunts used to work for. So this guy is, this is what happens when you're Palestinian, who's Palestine, everything becomes kind of interlinked. So this is the first accountant who is licensed in the British Mandatory period. He established a company called Saba and Company. It continues to be a very important multinational corporation. Very interesting guy. He's interesting because he is funding the rebels in the period of the revolt. And at the same time that he is containing what is, I believe, the rebels' most important challenge, which is the challenge to social hierarchy. So he's interesting because he invites us to think about later moments in the Palestinian struggle when you have major capitalists who are funding the armed struggle. What does that mean? How do we make sense of it, right? And so he is a really interesting guy. One of the ways he's also interesting is how he and the editors around him, who are all self-defining as economists in really interesting ways, how they're shaping what they call a material meltdown, right? So this is an economic effervescence that they're really trying to think through. They were so invested in distinguishing what they did as economic, as separate from the political. So they're involved in this very modernist imperative that said, here's the social, here's the political, here's the economic, we're economic, we are different, we are more professional from these men of politics, we are men of capital. And they are judicious, they're authentic, that's how they describe themselves, right? Not how I'm describing them. And they are very set on embracing technology, on investing in innovation, with some really kind of radically exclusive ideas, like eugenics comes up. Okay. And one of the things that they are so also very invested in is the idea, the relationship to money, and how is it that spending and saving is crucial to the future of the future that they imagine, which is one of prosperity. Okay, so here you are seeing a kind of linking between the idea of progress and the idea of profit as inextricable in many ways. There's also an ideal woman, and here I spent, again, many hours and months and years with a woman named Sadwa Saeed who ran a radio program called The New Arab Home, and I spent a lot of time hating this woman because she reminded me so much of myself in many ways, because she was all about, my cousin's here, she's going to get this because we come from the same family. And she was very insistent on having clocks in every room, on having books and ledgers where you write everything you spend, on making sure your house is impeccably clean, on very particular standards of hygiene, right? And this is very important because this happens in many other places, many other spaces and times, where you see this, when this abstraction of the national economy is coming into play, it is happening at the same time that the idea of a domestic economy is taking shape as separate but parallel. Okay, so her role is she is the most sublime at her home, and her role is to manage the household budget, to manage her home, to manage herself, right, and to manage her man. And one of the things I found most interesting about this was the way that also her, how well she did as a domestic manager was directly linked to keeping her man at home. Okay, so women in this understanding of the relationship to money and what you do with it, women in this understanding have this natural tendency to consume, right? And so their goal is to put that natural tendency into buying Palestinian or buying Arab. But men have a natural tendency too, and that's that they're always tempted. And so they're tempted by all of these now unspecified houses of entertainment that are everywhere. And so the women's role is to keep her man at home. If he cheats on her, it's because she didn't keep a tidy house. And this is something my grandmother used to say to me all the time, right? Oh, so-and-so cheats on, well, that's because her house is dirty, right? With these Palestinian men of capital, I think the project here is to say, again, these aren't just shadows. You know, they're not just shadows of the settler or the British colonial official. They have a project, they have an imagination, they understand themselves as part of a broader Arab world. But it's time we critique that Arab liberal movement, right? Because it was not, again, exceptionally exclusionary. It was contingent on exclusion. And I think the moment for me that really captured that and made it very urgent was when I submitted the first rendition of this manuscript around 14 August 2013. And I was in Palestine at the time and heading back to Cairo to teach. And this was the day that Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who is the present ruler of Egypt, who had basically was part of this sort of popular mobilization, right, who really kind of manipulated and overthrew the first democratically elected rule in Egypt of the Muslim Brotherhood, and shortly thereafter conducted the largest massacre in modern Egyptian history. And for me, this was a really formative moment because I saw my students, my peers, my friends, my mentors, all who self-defined as liberal, denying, dismissing, or justifying the massacre. And for me, the question then is, how then does this liberal project allow for the exclusion of this very category of the human? Thank you.